Welcome students. Today we are going to start a topic. The name of the topic is Preface to Lyrical Ballads, written by Wordsworth. The book name of the book is The Lyrical Ballads with a few other poems. This is a collection of poems written by Wordsworth and Samuel Coleridge. Basically, the book published in 1798, but it is considered to have marked the beginning of English Romantic movement in English literature. Wordsworth occupied a very important rank in the history of English literature because of this book. The book is the landmark in the history of English literature also. Wordsworth's greatness as a poet has almost universally been recognized because of this book. One modern critic has called him one of the giants of English poetry. Some critic called him a mountain, the most massive in the lofty range which is called the Romantic Revival. Matthew Arnold, the greatest critic of the Victorian age, gave a high rank to Wordsworth. He called Wordsworth one of the chief glorious of English poetry. According to Arnold, the poetical performance of the Wordsworth is, after that of Shakespeare and Milton, undoubtedly the most considerable from the Elizabethan age to the present time. So it has been pointed out almost every critic that Wordsworth's poetic work is singularly uneven and that there is a lot of his work. So this is necessary to us that his poetic work is very important and considerable to us. The second point is very important. The preface to Lyrical Ballads is an essay composed by William Wordsworth for the second edition of the poetry, published in January 1801 and greatly expanded later in the third edition in 1802. The book has became as a manifesto of the poetry, and it was also one of the beginning of the new era in English poetry. So it has become de facto manifesto, means major intention is very important of the poet for publishing this book. This is one of the landmark and corner for the change in English literature. There are four guidelines included in this book, in the essay also. First, ordinary life is the best subject for the poetry. Ordinary life. Ordinary life means the common man is very important for the Wordsworth. He had chosen low and rustic life for treatment in his poetry. He chose the life because, according to him, the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity. In humble and rustic life, the essential passions of the persons are less under restraint and therefore express themselves in a plainer and more empathetic manner in the poetry. So Wordsworth says that humble and rustic life, the elementary feelings of the human beings, coexist in a state of greater simplicity. So the manners of the rural life germinate from those feelings. Necessary character of rural occupations, those manners are more easily comprehended. And finally, in humble and rustic life, the passions of men are incorporated with the beautiful and permanent form of nature. So the Wordsworth's opinion, persons living in countryside and pursuing rural occupations are the best fitted for the portrayal in poetry because these people live in an environment which is more favorable to the growth and development of the essential passions of human heart. Because in his environment, people do not suffer from anything and therefore speak a plainer and more forceful language. These people lead simple lives and simple feelings of an elementary kind. So, these people live in contact with the beautiful and permanent objects of nature. The objects means mountains, streams, trees, flowers, etc. The natural atmosphere, natural maturing of the feelings, passions in the hearts of these people. So ordinary life is the best subject for the poetry. Second point, everyday language is the best suited for the poetry. Everyday means common man's language, rural man's language. The poet is a man speaking to men. This is the definition according to Wordsworth. While he is telling us the what is poet. Poet is a man speaking to men. So he in this statement he puts before us the very important feelings about the poet. That common man's is central common man is the central idea of his poetry. He was to treat of the things of everyday life, to open out the soul of little and unfamiliar things. One of the name of his poem is, for example, The Idiot Boy. In this poem, he tells us how a boy was sent to an errand at night for a sick neighbor. But how, forgetting it, he stayed gazing at the beauty of waterfall in the moonlight, till his mother felt afflicted by fear at his long absence. So these are, I think, a second example is very important. That how the Harry Gill was harsh to poor. So many examples are there also there. We are seven, second poem. Tintern Abbey, rural atmosphere, very good, very deeply painted by him, the natural atmosphere in Tintern Abbey also. So Wordsworth's emotions touched with the nature, and he is more emotive person. So he tells us here everyday language. Everyday language means common man's language is the best suited for the poetry, for understanding better poetry also. Third, expression of feelings is the more important than action or plot. According to Wordsworth, feelings are very important. Feelings means emotions. So civilized poet means not a ordinary person, but he is beyond the life also there. His reactions are very important towards uh, basically he tells us back to nature. Wordsworth means also tells us here the fresh reunion of reality and ideality also. He wants to combine philosophy and uh, humanity in the poetry. So he tells us here the expression of feelings is more important than the action and plot. Feelings with the humble and rustic life he may penetrate in his poetry also there. Secondly, last, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of emotion that takes its origin from emotion and recollected in tranquility. This is, I think, a world famous definition made by, painted by Wordsworth for the greatness of poetry. So, poetry is a spontaneous overflow of the powerful feelings. Spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings means emotions, feelings. Again, he repeated the same thing in his definition also. These feelings are very important. Sensible sensibility towards life is very important according to him, for the poet. So, secondly, next, poetry as a language of common people. And he tells us here the main idea. In the preface to Lyrical Ballads, he presents his views. He revised the book in the hope of larger reading audience. He rejects conventional approaches. Basically, the book is the revolt to the conventional approaches of the poetry, because he demands here, he demands here, he gives importance to the common people language, as well as the he tells us here the importance of poets' ability to transmit the experience in the same accessible level. He speaks of poetry as the existing from the poet, one person to another person, with the minimal, no intermediary also needed. And secondly, as a romantic poet, he values humble, rustic ways of country folk. Common people have directly experienced the truths of nature. Their experiences can be translated in the poetry that includes same honesty, love, directness. He finds in homogeneous rural setting. So the poem which the poet creates, it is the powerful and genuine feelings. These lead to the reflection and simple wisdom painted in ordinary language to recreate the original emotion. Prose and poetry. Second point. Poet, according to Wordsworth, must pay attention to the close connection with the poetry with the prose. According to him, according to him, all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. Poetry takes its origin from emotion, recollected in tranquility. In the light of above statement, Wordsworth discusses his theory of poetic process in the poetic composition. Another important point is here that there is neither is nor can be any essential difference between the language of prose and metrical composition. He tells us here that there is no difference between the prose and poetry, in the language of prose and poetry. While he is sharing the view, he means poet is sharing his views with the proper purpose. To speak plainly, honestly in the language of the lives, daily language, common man's language is very important while he is expressing uh, the subject, a clear natural subject with the uh, reader or the particular uh, audience. He does not believe in the separation of poetry and prose as the two opposite approaches. But he repeatedly tells us here that the same origins and the spirit should be accessible at the equal levels, prose and poetry. Poetry may be discussed, prose may be presented before us in the form of poetry also, and poetry may be expressed before us in the form of prose also. So prose and poetry means I think he had explained before us honestly and equal manner in the equal language also there. Wordsworth places little value on the factual and scientific in literature. He is more interested in the emotions of immediate experience reflected upon and how he understood the particular fact. He can see the significance of the scientific inquiry and knowledge also there. So for speaking the truth of the lives, for speaking the truth of life means real life is very important. His contemporaries, he keeps a distance between the literature and applied scientific literature also. So Wordsworth, this type of literature does not unite the scientific with ordinary people on a daily basis. He keeps isolated in the world of facts. Isolated means his own separately in this particular era of English literature. Writing as he was in the first years in his, when the book was published, he could not anticipate the enormous role of the scientific research and experimentation that he has assumed in his. Since then, uh, the preface to Lyrical Ballads is a new, I think, a world literary sensibility which is focused to the changing world. Changing means new world. However, scientifically, he presents before us the common man's rustic life, common man's language, common man's speech, and common man's life, total life is must be reflected in the poetry also. Lastly, he presents before us the role of the poet. According to Wordsworth, he in this the last point, Wordsworth gives us his broad sense of the role of poet, not short but broad-minded view for the poetry and poet also there. He expressed in the language and the particular content. A person, poet is a person of common people. He may relate to the common man's life. He may in touch with the rustic life. So, common man's life. So there is no difference between the language of hmm, prose and poetry also, and no difference between the language of people. The language of the people in rural life, he may adapt because Such people communicate with the best objects, from which, in his opinion, the best part of language is originally derived. And he adapted the language because he thinks that people in rural life convey their emotions, feelings, and notions through simple and unelaborated expressions. And these people are less under the influence of social vanity than people living in the cities. So, the language of the people, these people, Wordsworth took care to purify it of its defects, of all causes of dislike and disgust. Dislike or disgust. Such Wordsworth is more permanent, more philosophical in this point, which is generally employed by the poet. So Wordsworth explores the practice of poets to separate themselves the sympathies of readers. So this is very important to us as a scientific, as a new scientist. Wordsworth's time forged ahead in chemistry and botany. So the poet represents the first and last, poet is the first and last of all knowledge. And poetry also is the first and final spirit of knowledge also there. As immortal as the heart of man. The poet will lend the divine spirit and transfiguration into the knowledge. So Wordsworth and others hope to inspire. The role of art stands far apart from applied science of any kind. So the poet remains a special person who can take ordinary experiences of common people and presents before the people in very common way. So Wordsworth's opinion that the best poems are written strictly in the language of prose. And when the prose is well written, he quotes also, for example, a sonnet of Gray. He says that the language of the lines in this poem, which have any value, does not differ much from that of prose. So Thomas Gray's poetry is the finest example for the prose in poetry. So these are the 4 points, main ideas for the preface to lyrical ballads. We are studying step by step the diction of the poetry in this preface to lyrical ballad. In the next lecture, we will continue the diction of poetry. So today we stop here.